old and new phenomenon. New because the internet disseminates information about them within seconds. And prior to this type of communication, that kind of information was very limited. It's new because they can be bought from China or Russia or other sources on the internet, and because they are not for human use, the legal issues are very fuzzy. New because there are new drugs emerging at a pace that is faster than any one of us ever projected in the past. And new because the DEA and the public are challenged by the pace at which they're emerging. New because the marketing of these drugs is different than the old-time marketing. New because there are no shady characters and alleys that sell these drugs. And new because some are deadly. These are human experiments in the making. I'd like to begin by discussing how drugs have come about. Modern drugs were isolated from plants. They were isolated because human beings were always foraging for food. And by chance, they were able to uncover certain plants that had medicinal properties. Some of these were used to alleviate heart problems. Some of them were used to alleviate fevers and pain and malaria. And while we were foraging, we also understood and discovered some drugs that yielded pleasurable sensations. Some were mildly arousing, like nicotine or caffeine. They enhanced our mood. They changed our perception. They reduced our pain. Others intoxicated and produced euphoria, like, for example, cat and marijuana and alcohol and ephedrine and opioids. Along about 200 years ago, chemists began to think carefully, what are these plants producing? Why do they have medicinal effects? And they started to isolate the active ingredients of these plants. Cathinone was isolated from the khat plant, and delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol from marijuana, and ephedrine, and then later on methamphetamine was made from ephedrine from the ephedra or mahuang plant, and heroin and morphine were isolated from the opiate plant. So these were crystallized, they became available in highly purified forms, and then people began to use them not only for medicinal purposes, but for psychoactive purposes. And it was at this time when we had the availability of these plants at high concentrations in purified form that we began to see the consequences in terms of behavior, in terms of destruction, in terms of bodily, physical harm, in terms of death. So we come to a new phase now, a phase in which there are more and more drugs coming into the illicit drug market that are new, some are old, some have been gleaned from ancient sources, but they are becoming an ever-growing problem. And we're going to try in the next hour to summarize a few of these questions. What are designer drugs? What drives the designer drug markets? What are some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of use, especially amongst our youth? Are designer drugs legal or illegal? Do they fall in a gray zone or a red zone in terms of their so-called attractiveness? And who uses them and why? And what are the effects? What are the harmful effects? And then a summary of what we can glean from this information. So what are some of the categories of designer drugs? Probably the two most prominent ones are bath salts, which are stimulants, hallucinogens, entactogens, empathogens. We'll try to explain that in a few moments. Essentially, they combine certain properties of cocaine, amphetamine, with hallucinatory properties such as LSD, and with other types of sensations that that create or generate empathy with others, such as ecstasy. The second major class of these drugs are cannabinoids, synthetic marijuana analogues. Spice, K2, these are chemicals that are sold increasingly to young people, and this is becoming a problem, as we will see, in terms of the consequences. Then there are dragonflies, and dragonflies have nothing to do with dragonflies except the shape of the chemical happens to look like a dragonfly, so they've been named dragonflies. There are new ones coming down coming into our awareness, which are morphine analogues. Krokodil is one of them, which is a tremendous plague in Russia, especially in Siberia, and it causes devastation to the individuals using it. And then the hallucinogens, some of the standard ones and some newly created ones. The designer drug industry is a niche business with a single strategy, and the strategy is to circumvent drug laws and promote their products as legal. This is a huge and lucrative business because the precursors, the chemicals that you need to make them, are very inexpensive, and yet they can be sold in vast quantities and by the pound quantities, and they have tremendous appeal because they are so inexpensive, and they serve as good competition for the conventional drug producers. They create new markets, new people. They recruit new individuals into the drug culture, and the profits are very rapid. I can go online this moment, if I was hooked up to the internet, and show you a website that took me about 3 seconds to find in China that will sell me enough methadone to use for a year for $10. They undercut the producers and prices of common illegal drugs. They undermine routine drug testing, and that's a big problem, because there are many industries for which routine drug testing is mandated by the federal government. For example, airline pilots, truck drivers, people working in the nuclear industry, people in the military. But many of these drugs can't be detected because the routine tests simply don't pick them up. They certainly can be detected by sophisticated methods that sophisticated chemists are able to engage in, but certainly not the random testing that you see as a condition of employment or for truck drivers. This simply is not, it's not possible. So there are a myriad of these designer drugs. There are the cathinones. The cathinones are overrepresented in bath salts. They're the hallucinogenic amphetamines, which are the dragonflies. There are MDMA or ecstasy related. There are the synthetic cannabinoids, of which there's a myriad of them, hundreds and hundreds of possibilities. The piperazines, hallucinogens. I won't get into all of these because it's impossible to summarize. And then there are the dissociative anesthetics that are ketamine-like or PCP-like, phencyclidine. All of these are emerging currently in our society. The movement began primarily in Europe in the mid-2000s, and it has grown and grown. In fact, I submitted a grant to study them when I started to smell this movement in Europe. And the grant was turned down. I wanted to investigate what the biology of these drugs were. The grant was turned down by reviewers who said, well, this is a European problem. It will never come to the US. And that was just a few years ago. And so I never did the studies. This is probably one of the most alarming graphs I've seen. Every one of these bars gives a number of new, unique synthetic drugs that are being marketed to people, primarily to young people and to adults, to adolescents and adults. And in 2010, for the cannabinoids, there were about 18 or 19 available, different ones. In 2011, that was over 40 different cannabinoids. And by 2012, there are over 50 different cannabinoids being marketed. With synthetic cathinones, these are the ingredients of bath salts. Again, we see exactly the same trends. We're seeing so many of these. How does law enforcement, how do parents keep up with this array? How does drug testing keep up with this array? And this is why this is such a unique challenge that is really different than we have seen in the past. So how do these chemicals come about? Where do they come from? What is the history of them? Let's just begin with designer drugs, the bath salts. The designer drugs, and nobody has to be a chemist to realize that this is a little compound that's present in our body. It's called phenethylamine. And phenethylamine gives rise, it can be created converted to amphetamine and methamphetamine and ecstasy quite easily. It can also give rise to cathinone and mephedrone and methylone, and it also can give rise to pyrovalerone and naphthalone and MDPV or methylene dioxypyrovalerone, all of which can be thrown into bath salts and sold and marketed with this very deceptive and potentially very dangerous combination. Bath salts are not real bath salts. They're not Avon products. They're not Jergens products. They're not any of these. They are simply sold as such with the deceptive view that if you market them as bath salts, people who really are in the know that you can use them for psychoactive purposes, but for the innocent, they will think that, well, this is an innocent product. So we see in bath salts alone, what is so disturbing is that there are at least 46 different types of compounds in them, of which we know almost nothing in terms of the biology, the long-term effects, what can happen to kids who use them. They're sold in head shops, they're sold in gas stations, they're sold on the internet. How do we recognize bath salts? If they're sold as bath salts, the warning signs are, is it in small packets? You're not going to buy bath salts for your bath in little envelopes. That's not the way it's usually sold. They're sold in jars, they're sold in large containers. Is it labeled not for human consumption? Most bath salts that you use in a bath are not labeled that way. What it means is they're covering themselves legally by saying it's not for human consumption. Is it labeled not illegal? That's another deceptive practice to try to convince people that if you want to use this to consume it, it's illegal. It is legal. Therefore, you're not going to be arrested for possession or for distribution. Is it labeled adults only? How many of you would restrict a teenager to not using your bath salts if they want to relax after a heavy basketball game or a soccer game or whatever they engage in? And if it's sold as plant food or fertilizer, that's very strange with all these caveats. And these are some of the labels on these bath salts. Tiger blood, ivory soft. How deceptive, because we are all aware of Ivory soap, which is a long-standing brand name that's been used for generations of people. The primary sources are these unregulated labs, manufacturers in cities in China and Wuhan and Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Beijing. As I said, I can go on the internet like this and access these so-called research products, these so-called chemicals, these so-called not for human consumption. But we know there's only one reason why they are being sold. Here is this I just took off the web. Plant Feed Shop offers 99.9% pure 4-MMC, which is a cathinone, for botanical and lab research requirements. Please send email. The product will be delivered within 2 to 4 days. And we are the leading suppliers of plant food and research chemicals, mephedrone, MDMA, MDAI, MEC, MDPV, and so on. How many plants are nourished with these drugs? Just think about it. First of all, they must think that the American public is not very wise. To be so blatant about it, they must think our Drug Enforcement Agency is not very wise. So what are designer drugs, the marijuana type? The two big brand names that are out are K2 and Spice. Both of them contain a whole array of synthetic cannabinoids, and they are a cause of tremendous concern, which we will get into in terms of their biological effects. One of the problems with them is that they are produced by spraying the chemical on plants, on herbs. They're called herbal joys and what have you, but they're sprayed, and they're not sprayed evenly, so that people who've done the analysis find huge concentrations of it because the spraying is so uneven, huge in one part of the plant and a small amount in the other, so that overdosing is quite easy, and getting a high dose that causes a tremendous crisis is quite simple. And then we have the dragonflies, and you can see why they're called that. In terms of chemistry, these are called rigid analogues. It means that the structure is not really bendable and movable the way it is for certain other compounds. The rigid structure almost takes the shape of a so-called dragonfly, and that's why it's called that. Krokodil, I just came back from Russia, and there was a lot of discussion on this drug, which causes, the reason it's called Krokodil is because it causes tremendous skin lesions. There are photographs of people who you can actually see the bone coming through because you get such tremendous rot from the ingredients that are used to make Krokodil, which includes iodine and red phosphorus, which are highly impure, contaminated with toxic, corrosive byproducts, similar to heroin, shorter duration, and cause brain damage. And the notoriety of this drug in Russia is horrendous. And the life expectancies apparently are quite short for people using. So where do these designer drugs come from? What's the origin of them? Did brilliant, malevolent chemists working for cartels create them? No. They came from the legitimate scientific literature. There are 3 people who are probably 3 of the most prominent chemists. Dr. David Nichols, who's made a lot of the drugs that have become Dragonfly, Dr. John Huffman, who made a whole array of cannabinoids, and Dr. Shulgin, who's an individual that has a different perspective than the first 2. But both of these gentlemen, Nichols and Huffman, they both have spent an academic career creating new drugs, trying to understand a number of biological principles as well as potential medications. Because so many drugs that have psychoactive properties also may have some properties that are valuable as medications. And of the three, Dr. Shulgin is probably the most well-known in terms of trying to disseminate how to make these drugs. He published a book, a cookbook, because he wanted the public to be able to do this, or perhaps not, but that is one of the theories of his publication of this Pikal book. But he originally started as a chemist. The other two are profoundly disappointed that the drugs that they used in academic settings are the ones that are being borrowed from the scientific literature and being made in small shops and major labs, in clandestine labs throughout the world. So why do they make these compounds? They make them in order to try to develop new medications. They make them for basic science. And I'll show you a few examples of why they've done it. And if you're an academic, you have to publish your research. But when you publish these how to make them, you publish exactly the cookbook for production. Here's an example. How does one drug dock into a protein? And if you change it a little bit, does it dock differently? Is it going to produce a different biological effect just by shifting the structure a little bit? So to try to understand at the most discrete level of biology, how does a drug hit its target in the brain or in the body? And how does it produce an effect by its shape matching the shape of its target? And we have another source of this information is not just the medicinal chemistry and pharmacology journals, but also patents. Some of these clandestine labs have searched through US patents because the patents has to provide every possible structure. If you want to cover intellectual property, you have to give all the possible ways, all the possible products that could be made from your invention, as well as how to make it. So they surf these patents, they surf the literature. And here's another example of an application. This is a brain map of where marijuana goes in the brain, but marijuana is a terrible drug to use. So one of the drugs that was produced, which is a synthetic marijuana, is very, very good for mapping marijuana targets in the brain. Why is this important? It's important because if these targets change in response to drugs, you want to understand it. You want to be able to see whether or not the brain is altered under the influence of certain drugs, and especially the cannabinoid system. So these drugs have had tremendous applications in legitimate science and in legitimate pharmaceutical industry. But these manuscripts that were published in good faith through a white light were broken into a prism of many, many different alternatives by patent fishing, by literature fishing, and they became the designer drugs that are used currently in the market. And the possibilities are thousands upon thousands of drugs. Thousands. When a chemist friend of mine, we collaborated for years trying to develop medications to treat cocaine addicts, and we designed and created and produced over 600 compounds, which we know if it's in the wrong hands, it can get into the designer drug illicit market. So what drives designer drugs? As I said, internet sales, production, and information. The information that kids get is instantaneous. It's on Facebook, it's on many other sites. Deceptive marketing, these very sweet little trademarks. The legal status is in a gray zone. It evades drug testing. And what about the end user? Why do they use these drugs? Well, some of them want to have novel sensations and feelings and experiences, and they want to share them. I've just read a tome from a physician who thinks that these drugs have spiritual insights that can expand the mind. I've heard it before from Timothy Leary in the 1960s, and I prefer to subscribe to Arthur Kessler's view of this, that in fact these drugs are con artists that con the brain into thinking of new realities, but those realities are not what is this world that we inhabit. Some people use it to evade drug testing, and some people use it to evade the legal consequences. They use it for many reasons. The marketing of drugs to deceive law enforcement and consumers is at its high point now. On the left, you will see, oops, my mouse is, you will see these are heroin shaped to look like beans, and these are real beans. And then you mix them together and you can't really tell the difference between the two. I've actually seen these up close and personal at the DEA headquarters. White dove, what an innocent label to deceive people. These are supposedly ecstasy pills made to look like cartoon characters. In fact, they didn't have ecstasy, they had other constituents in them that were more hazardous, if one can be more hazardous. So this is a human experiment that we are witnessing now in our nation, and a very dangerous human experiment, because these drugs are being marketed to teens and young adults, people without knowledge, without knowledge or judgment in terms of what the possible consequences could be long-term for their lives. Stuck. The drugs are of unknown composition. There's no consistency in manufacturing. Some of these labs in China tell you, we have HPLC. That's an acronym for high liquid chromatography, high pressure liquid chromatography, and GCMS, gas mass spectroscopy. They actually, there's no way you can know if they're actually testing the purity of these. That's nonsense. They send you a printout of their purity from these very sophisticated tests, but you don't know if that's really the case. This could never happen in a pharmaceutical company that is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. They're not tested for human consumption. We have no idea. The drugs that go through the Food and Drug Administration approval process are tested to the extreme. I won't get into all of the criteria that are used, but there are so many criteria that some of the applications to get a drug approved are up to 100,000 pages. And here we have drugs being tested in people. And the tests are quite simple. A few reports of deaths and people move on to another one. That's not the way to conduct our lives. That's not the way to conduct our society, is to use our children, our young people, as guinea pigs for these substances. We don't know, for so many of them, if we have 50 to 100 new compounds emerging every year. We don't know what their actions are going to be in the brain or the body, and we certainly don't know the dosage. We don't know how they'll interact with alcohol or with other drugs or with medications. We simply do not know. And that's one of the reasons that there's a massive need to educate the public on what the possibilities are. What are some of the trends? The European Union's Psychonaut Web Mapping Project of legal highs has found more than 200 discussion forums and social media and online shops and websites on YouTube, on eBay, on Google Insight, that offer information to people on these drugs and where sources of purchasing them. There are over 410 substances that they currently have detected. The information is valuable not only for law enforcement but for parents because the scientific data is so scarce. And they were the ones who detected spice and methadone and naphorone and MDPV from a single country and saw it spread throughout Europe and then cross the Atlantic and circumvent the globe. So what is so interesting, and this is really point number one, after a drug is made illegal, the online searches decrease. And there's good evidence from England, for example, that as soon as they scheduled the drugs and made some of them illegal, after all these reports of terrible consequences, drug use went way down. So those folks who argue the drug war is lost and making drugs illegal is not going to help, we have very solid information that's putting a drug into a red zone, an illegal zone, really does cut down on use. What are some of the trends with synthetic marijuana and bath salts in high school students? Well, in the past year, this is the most recent data we have for 12th graders, more than 11% used synthetic marijuana in the past year. And that went down to close to 9% for 10th graders and 4.4% for 8th graders. This to me is just unacceptable because really and truly these compounds are just playing Russian roulette with one's mind and one's body. And for 10th and 12th graders, the synthetic cannabinoids are the second most widely used drug after marijuana. And for 8th graders, it's the third most widely used drug after marijuana and inhalants. The trends in college for synthetic marijuana, synthetic cannabinoids, much more use among males than females, very high use. The percent used is 20% in this college and in the Southeastern University. Sexual orientation showed a dichotomy. Heterosexuals were less likely to use than people in the LGBT community. People who don't use alcohol are much less likely to use. People who don't use marijuana are much less likely to use. So we see trends that immediately tell us there's a gender issue. There's also an aversion to drugs that protects people from using them, and that aversion extends to alcohol and marijuana. And those who are already experimenting with psychoactive drugs, this is a much more prominent feature. Now, what about the legal status? There's a good rationale for restricting these drugs. There's an actual or potential for abuse and addiction. The psychoactive effects for some of them are dreadful. The risk to public health is high. And why? Because of driving under the influence, suicides, homicides, drugs abused to evade drug screens, overdose illness, deaths. And the analogues that are currently controlled, the same reasons apply. So are the designer drugs legal? Well, The DEA in October of 2011 controlled 3 synthetics that are sold as bath salts or plant foods. They're illegal. They extended control of 5 fake marijuana products. They're illegal. And then in June of last year, 26 others were placed into the Controlled Substance Act and Schedule 1. They're illegal. And possession, sale of these chemicals or products are illegal in the US. Now here's the problem. So we have 26 and maybe 10 and so on, but now we're seeing 100 new ones coming up every year. So the DEA decided we have to keep ahead of these folks, ahead of these chemists. How do you do that? Instead of saying in the past, this chemical is the one that's illegal. Cocaine is a single molecule. Heroin is a single. We're going to say that any drug that looks like the one that's illegal is illegal, and any drug that acts on the same targets in the brain as the illegal drug is going to be also designated illegal. So now they can cast a much wider net in terms of what they're going to call illegal, so that the lookalikes are also going to be in legal red zones instead of gray zones. And that's terrific. They also said we need more time to show that our decision is right. So they now have 36 months to gather the scientific evidence. And what we not only see at the federal level, we see at the state level. New Jersey, Arkansas, Nebraska, Ohio, Florida, Michigan, there are bills coming up constantly to ban these chemicals because the newspaper headlines are almost daily in terms of a disaster. Again, I emphasize that the illegal status reduces use because these were calls to poison control centers in Florida, in this state, and as soon as the legal status was clarified by the DEA and made illegal, the poison control center calls declined precipitously, which meant that far fewer people were using. So let's take a little closer look at some of these. Bath salts. Bath salts not picked up on standard drug tests. They are available in convenience stores and head shops and on the internet. They are ingested, they're injected IV, they're administered rectally, they're insufflated. They can come in the form of pills or capsules, and insufflation is the most common. These are the ingredients of most of the designer drugs: methadone, methylone, methylene dioxypyrovalerone, and benzylpiperazone. What we see is that calls to poison control centers increased exponentially between June and of 2010 and 11. This is DEA data. What does this tell you? These things are dangerous. People are getting overdosed, they're getting poisoned, and they're panicking and calling a poison control center. Bath salts affect many organs: the brain, eyes, ears, nose, throat, the lungs, the heart, blood vessels, kidneys, hormones, digestive tract, and reproduction. At least 56% of users report adverse consequences. Now, if you try to get the FDA to approve a drug, and more than half the people said, this drug is making me dreadfully ill, it would never happen. The only thing would happen is if this was the only cancer drug available for a terminal illness, the FDA would say, well, we have to do a risk-benefit. You lose your hair, you get terribly weak, you have your muscles just decay, but you will get better, and therefore these adverse effects are acceptable. But for drugs such as this, a 56% adverse consequence is completely unacceptable. And as we'll see, you can affect the brain, kidney, almost every organ in the system. Palpitations, shortness of breath, chest pain, dry mouth, abdominal pain, loss of appetite, vomiting, erectile dysfunction, skin discoloration, muscle tension, all of these. What about the psychoactive effects? We are stuck. Psychoactive effects: bath salts, aggression, dizziness, memory loss, seizures, blurred vision, anxiety, hallucinations, depression, unhappiness, dysphoria, euphoria, fatigue, increased energy, decreased concentration, panic, paranoia. Methadone is addictive. That's one of the main constituents of bath salts. 50% considered addictive. 17% of users report addiction symptoms. The highest frequency of daily use falls in the 11 to 15-year-old range. The range that we have to protect more than anyone else because they are the most likely. They have the highest susceptibility to becoming addicted. The case reports of methadone and bath salts: a man repeatedly stabs himself in the face. A university student runs head-on into traffic and is killed. A daughter attacks a 71-year-old mother with a machete. A mother leaves a 2-year-old daughter on a highway median. A man jumps into a police station thinking someone is hiding under his car. He jumps from a third-story window, fleeing non-existent person. A couple destroy the home walls, trying to stab imaginary people living in them. A man flees a car, thinks he's melting, and chased by electricity. And so on, and so on, and so on. These are case reports. They're ugly. They're alarming. And what it tells you is that the psychoactive properties of this class of drugs is, in fact, highly dangerous to an individual and to family members and to friends and to the public. The medical effects, I've already summarized them to some extent: cardiovascular, psychological, neurological, musculoskeletal, gastrointestinal. There's no point in reading them all to you, but almost every organ system is affected. And the clinical symptoms are, besides the psychological effects, probably the most prominent effects are on the cardiovascular system. Increased heart rate, high blood pressure, chest pain. That's alarming for young people. Those are alarming symptoms. So how do bath salts work in the brain? What do they do? We all know, or we should know, that the brain communicates chemically. It uses chemical messages for one nerve cell, the ending of one nerve cell, to talk to another. And within these systems, there is what's called a transporter, which is shown in brown here. These little transporters, they're key. That's where antidepressants work. That's where cocaine works. That's where amphetamine works. That's where the bath salts work. These transporters, their job is to take the chemical messages between nerve cells and suck them, transport them, truck them back from where they came from in order for the brain to reset, in order for the brain to come back after a signal goes by. So what happens is, when this is not functioning well, all this is animated, but it's not functioning. When these red triangles, the bath salt drug, blocks these transporters, you get this inundation, this flood of chemical signals in the brain, much greater than ever before. And the flood, and part of that flood is also in your vascular system. That's why you have such tremendous effects on blood pressure and heart rate, because the same system works in terms of regulating heart rate and blood pressure. And bath salts are likely to affect many brain regions, and the reason for that is that these brain regions are also affected by conventional drugs that are similar to them, like amphetamines. So let's summarize bath salts. Most of them are cathinones. Not all of them have the same psychoactive effects or the same health risks. But because there's such a mixture, a dirty mixture, we simply don't know which ones are doing what. They engender risks and adverse consequences in terms of emergency department mentions. The effects persist for long periods of time. They have addiction potential. They have prominent psychiatric and cardiovascular effects, and they have been associated with significant number of deaths in the country. What about synthetic cannabinoids, marijuana? The cannabinoids that are designed to resemble marijuana, K2 or spice, bliss, black mamba, blaze, Bombay blue, genie, etc., etc., herbal blends, incense, air refreshener. All of these names have been given in order to market these drugs to the unsuspecting people. Once again, the call to poison control centers for synthetic cannabinoids has just shot up. And that's when the DEA began to act, when they realized this is becoming a very serious problem. So let's take a look at what is K2 spice. They're synthetic forms of marijuana. They're mixtures of dried, shredded plants sprayed with THC-like chemicals. Their onset time is very quick. If they're smoked, they can last for 1 to 8 hours. They have many, many effects. What are some of these effects? They are similar to marijuana, and some of them may be different. So let's take a comparison of marijuana with synthetic cannabinoids. The similarities are that they both produce a high heart rate, red eyes, anxiety, sedation, hallucinations. They can produce an acute psychosis and memory deficits. How are the symptoms different with regard to the synthetics? They can promote seizures, low blood potassium, high blood pressure, nausea, vomiting, agitation, violent behavior, and coma. So they are similar, they are different, and I can give you some of the reasons why during the question period as to why they are somewhat different. The positive effects are pleasant sensations, euphoria, relaxation, and sedation. The negative is, as we've said, severe paranoia. They can endanger themselves and others, agitation, delirium, headaches, panic attacks, anxiety, loss of control, confusion, psychosis, suicidal thoughts, seizures and tremors, good heavens. And they may affect many organs in the body, just as marijuana can. The brain, the lungs, the heart, blood vessels, kidney, digestive tract, reproduction, ears, eyes, nose, and throat, these are all listed. Psychological, neurological, cardiovascular, metabolic, GI, autonomic. And there is now a CDC report that just came out a few months ago showing that there's an acute kidney injury associated with synthetic cannabinoids. What is the biology? Biology is the same story, that these drugs resemble the chemical messages produced by the brain. So THC looks like this. The brain produces its own chemical message. The brain cannabinoid system is critical for controlling communication. It modulates brain communication by reducing chemical messages. The cannabinoid system of the brain is critical for brain development, and it controls messages that are involved in pleasure and mood and pain and appetite and motivation and memory. THC interferes with all of this. The synthetic cannabinoids, addiction to all of these have been reported. Physiological and psychological dependence is similar to that of marijuana. And the withdrawal syndromes are very, very prominent. High blood pressure, restlessness, craving, nightmares, sweating, nausea, quite extreme, in fact, these withdrawal symptoms, not that different from opioids. So let's summarize these. Spice and K2 are used widely by high school and college students. Emerging public health challenge. Their rapid rise in popularity, ready access from multiple sources, their production of acute psychological distress, their toxicology, and potential long-term effects, the ability to evade standard drug tests require a massive public education campaign and strategies to deter their use. We also have a whole host of other designer drugs. I'm not going to summarize most. Smiles has just emerged. It's an analog of one of the dragonflies. Its makeup is different from batch to patch, but it has very prominent psychoactive effects. In some cases, severe brain hemorrhaging and death. And the trends are this has been reported recently in Connecticut. The public is unaware of the potentially fatal side effects. Dragonfly, here's a shopping cart of what you can get for dragonfly type drugs. There's a number of documented deaths, and they are very, very problematical as well, because they have a syndrome with excited delirium, severe agitation, aggression, violence, and so on and so forth. There's no antidote for them. Again, another type of drugs sold as ketamine derivatives, methoxetamine and methylhexanamine, both of them are associated with deaths. So let's summarize. Designer drugs are a rapidly expanding threat to public health. A vast array of new drugs are being introduced. The contents, the doses of the substances are unknown. The drug interactions are unknown. The short and long-term effects are unknown. The toxicity reports are increasing rapidly. The effects on the developing brain are unknown. Routine drug testing is not feasible. And the legal status for the new ones, not the ones that were scheduled in 2011 and 12, but for many, is uncertain. It's a rapidly expanding threat to public health. The impact on brain, behavior, organ systems, cardiovascular systems is unacceptably high. Clinical research on each drug, there are now hundreds of them, is not feasible unless we have a massive scale-up of research funding. Drug combinations, you don't even know what's being sold in terms of 5 drugs and bath salts, or 10 or 3. So drug combinations challenges the research. And I really subscribe to the concept that we are engaged in a massive human experiment which is going to require years to resolve. What can concerned people do? What can they counsel others? Avoid consuming drugs that affect thinking, feelings, and judgment. My poor little computer is frozen. The adolescent brain is fragile and is not fully formed, and adolescents in particular should stay away from these drugs. No one knows what a street drug contains, how much, what the impurities are in the toxins. Intoxication is risky for health, for making unsafe and unhealthy choices. Any drug, legal or not, if not prescribed and used for medical purposes, can be unsafe. And no one can predict the long-term effects of designer drugs. So I close with 3 slides. One is the Faustian bargains. that people make when they use drugs and drug policy. Dr. Faustus was the subject of a play by Christopher Marlowe in England around 1600. And he wanted worldly pleasures, and he made a bargain with the devil that for 24 years he could do what he wanted, and then the devil would take him. And that's the Faustian bargain. Let's have as much experiences as possible, and someday we'll pay the penalty. But when he approached his 24 years, he became very concerned because he realized the bargain he made was not worth it. And he tried desperately not to fulfill his end of the bargain. But that was futile. With drug policy as well, we're in a Faustian bargain where we are trying, certainly not myself, but a number of others, are accommodating to people who want to experiment. And yet we all know that 24 years from now, as David Musto, the great historian on drug policy, has said, all the evidence will accumulate on the folly of making this bargain. And then we will have to not only suffer the consequences collectively for our fellow citizens, but also in terms of our nation. We must not make these Faustian bargains between pleasure, pain, full legal access, and weighing the medical, social, and legal consequences. Marijuana is considered by some a relatively mild drug, but we have just uncovered in the past year this excellent study done by Steve Kish and his collaborators that showed that the death rate among people who have a marijuana use disorder is slightly higher than those with an alcohol use disorder, lower than opioids, but nevertheless, it's 4 times higher. Now, with designer drugs, we can't even begin to project what the death rates will be, but this is unacceptable to assume that this is simply human experimentation that people should engage in order to explore their spiritual life, or people who are deceived by promises of legal status, not drug testing, and novel experiences. So I close with a thought that I've had for many years. This is not a war on drugs. The brain is the repository of our humanity. And when we try to impose constraints and strictures on drugs that can affect our brain, we are defending our brain. We are defending that brain which has developed philosophical thoughts, theater and music and poetry and calculus and literature and law and rockets and drugs and Kindles and 3D computer production, manufacturing, and iPhones, and a knowledge of DNA, an awareness of galaxies, robotic surgery, magnificent art, and black holes. We have to defend our brain. And that is the purpose of trying to disseminate this kind of information, as well as to restrict access to drugs that are toxic to it. Thank you. I'm going to take some questions now. The first question is, other than sending the victim to the emergency room, Is there anything a clinic, an outpatient could do to treat the victim if the exposure to the synthetic drug appears minimal? Well, I think that part of the failing of our healthcare system is that we tend to treat the physical symptoms, the crisis, the airway, the breathing, the cardiovascular, but we tend not to sit down afterwards and say to an individual, you have been in a very fortunate situation, your symptoms are minimal, and therefore goodbye and go home. That is not the way our healthcare system should be dealing with these issues. We should use an admission to a hospital or a visit to an emergency department that is not an acute crisis as an opportunistic moment, an opportunistic teaching moment, where every person in that emergency department, in that hospital, in a pediatric office, in an internist's office, is equipped to give an intervention and to counsel the individual on what the malevolent possibilities are with the use of these substances. We don't do it. This is beginning to spread, but it has to be universal principle for all our healthcare system. Any other questions? Well, I would like to, if there are no other questions, I would like to wrap up by announcing this webinar was brought to you by Drug Free America Foundation, Personal Enrichment Through Mental Health Services, and Live Well at the University of Tampa. We'd like to offer a special thanks to our supporters, Live Free Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition, Operation of PAR Incorporated, Hillsborough County Anti-Drug Alliance, the Florida Coalition Alliance. The webinar will be archived on the Drug Free America Foundation website at www.dfaf.org, along with downloadable materials. I'll repeat the website again, www.dfaf.org. And I thank you all for attending this session.